Okay, Francis, you are good to go.
Okay, thank you. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Father Frank McAloon. I'm Associate Professor of Christian Spirituality here at Fordham University in our Graduate School of Religion. And so I'm also a faculty member of the Fordham Research Consortium on Disability. And so both my school, Graduate Religion, and the consortium are sponsoring this event today. So very happy and pleased to introduce our presenter, who is Bill Gavin, and who, among other things, had a book that came out last year on this very topic, which is why we're so pleased to have him with us. And so he is the founder of the Summer Institute on Theology and Disability, and coordinator of the Collaborative on Faith and Disability. So for many, many years, he has been involved with the topic about which he is going to speak today. So I know we have folks both from Fordham University as well as broadly from the whole New York City area and throughout the country. So welcome everyone. There'll be a question and answer period at the probably the last half hour of our 90-minute time frame here. So keep a record of your questions, and you can, when the time comes, I'll remind you, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your page. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you. Thank you both.
Okay, let me share the screen. All right, can you hear me or?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. It's my delight to be part of this Fordham event this afternoon. I'm delighted when any Department of Religion or Social Studies or Ethics or Theology begins to develop some interest in dialogue with disability studies and pastoral care and support. So I'm really delighted to have a chance to do this. And what you're going to get, what you're going to hear from me this afternoon are some reflections that come from years of trying to be a bridge between the world of spirituality and faith on the one hand, and the worlds of secular and public services, private services, and advocacy on the other, trying to find ways for those two communities to talk with each other and work together for the sake of people with disabilities and their and the quality of their lives. The reason we've called this Tikkun Olam is, you know, the Jewish tradition about there being a break and a split in the universe. And I think for many people with disabilities, or the way we've looked at them in the past, the world of their spirituality and the world of their disability supports and services have been split, and not the people who surround them with different kinds of supports have not worked well together. A friend of mine long time ago showed me a cartoon. In fact, there was a picture of two kids in a sandbox who were all these toys and all this sand, and yet they were saying there's nobody to play with. You know, it's called parallel play. You know, rather than working with each other, but together. So let's see. Oh, I got to hit this over here. So why the gap? Why in the past this gap between professionals, public policy, and spiritual communities? I think there are a number of different reasons. There's not one. Spirituality is often seen as a private matter and not public, and often as a matter that is deeply meaningful to people, and sometimes people are not sure they want to share what they think at the heart of who they are. There are in human service systems a false interpretation of the separation of church and state. Sometimes it says, well, we can't talk about spirituality or faith because we're funded by the state, or we're funded by the feds or by Medicare. which is not correct. You can't proselytize, but you can talk about it and help people with those supports. There's also been the ye old traditional and gap and dialogue between science and religion about different perspectives of looking at the world and ways of looking at truth and beauty and goodness. One of a friend, there's a saying that says, in the world of science, in the world of faith and theology, what's good is the three qualities are what's good, what's beautiful, and what's good, true, and beautiful. And in the world of science, goodness is something that's observable. What's true is something that's measurable, and beauty is what's replicable. So different languages around looking and exploring the unknown. Especially in the world of intellectual and developmental disabilities, there's been an equation of faith with reason. How can people with intellectual disabilities understand religion, understand their faith? How can they know it? But it's interesting when we go, for instance, to 1 Corinthians 13. Now these three abide: faith, hope, and love. Faith is not necessarily understanding, but also trust and relationship. And we don't say that faith for people as we grow up at different ages of development is not faith. It's all part of the diversity of the ways we experience and express faith. There are these different languages of helping and different kinds of helping services and supports. And on both sides of the equation around inclusive ministries or working on spiritual supports, you will hear clergy often say, nobody ever trained us how to help our congregations become more inclusive. And on the secular side of things, you'll hear people in agencies and provider support groups or advocacy groups said, nobody ever taught us how to deal with spirituality appropriately. So it's sometimes that kind of anxiety about just not knowing what to do. And there's also, I think it's been a fear of each other's power and prominence. Sometimes in the world of human services, for instance, they may hear stories from people with disabilities and their families about troubling or wounding or really hard struggles that they've had. And some of those may include things that have been said to them in the context of faith or theological interpretations about their disability. Classically, what did you do that God sent you this disability? But other kinds of things that are of a neglect by a church or being asked to leave a congregation, negative kinds of stories that people hear about. And yet those negative stories also say something about the potential power of acceptance and of developing a way of seeing disability within the diversity of God's creation. So I think sometimes we in faith communities kind of resent the power and promise that scientists have, sometimes the pay grade, and on the other side, scientists and people in social sciences sometimes worry about the power and the prominence of religious tradition. And when both sides speak different languages, you get a lot of trouble there. And there have been bad experiences with the other on both sides. We can name easily ways in which social sciences have ended up developing things that are really problematic for people with disabilities. One of them would be the whole field of eugenics, for instance, in the last century, or the other experiences on the other side of people saying they have a really bad experience with their synagogue or church or parish. The premise, though, of my book, and also the premise that I want to talk about today, is I think that spirituality and disability, if you start out trying to understand one of those, you end up in the realm of the other. So let me share with you how I think that works. So if you try to understand what disability means in our day and time, one ends up in the realm of spirituality. How's that? Well, let's take a look at the kind of World Health Organization definition or the construct of what disability means. These days it's used around the world. A disability is a combination of a health condition, a disorder or disease that impacts body functions and structures, or may be impacted by the body structure, which together impact people's different kinds of daily activities and the activities they can participate in, whether they need accommodations or accessibility or others, which also then impact their ability to participate in the community and participate in the community as we know it. And you've got it. That's where the gap between medical model of disability and social model of disability is really crucial there, between the right and left of the screen, because the social model of disability would say it's not the body functions or the health condition that disables, it's society and attitudes and physical and other kinds of barriers and stereotypes. But that's also impacted by environmental factors, the culture that one is in, the philosophy that culture has about disability, the current states of supports and services, whether there's advocacy forward with people with disabilities, and also personal factors, which get into what do I think about my disability? How do I view my own disability? What's the meaning of it for me? What's the impact on my life and the way I try to shape my life? And a person, of course, is operating in the midst of that environment, which could include culture, cultural diversity, different religious perspectives, and all those things. So you put all that together, which impacts then what it means to be disabled. And when you get to then how the environment and personal factors impact participation, that's where it really comes down to what are the attitudes and beliefs and the meaning that we make out of disability that really impact people who have disabilities or chronic illnesses, that impact attitudes, self-concept, stereotypes, hearts and minds. So that where you get into, again, things that can't be proved by science or medicine, but into people's attitudes and the ways they make meaning. Spirituality, if you think about spirituality as the realm in which we try to discover and make meaning for our lives, individually and collectively, and to use a definition that comes out of the George Washington Institute on Spirituality and Health, that spirituality is the dimension of a person that seeks to find meaning in his or her life, and it's the quality that supports connection to and relationships with the sacred, as well as with each other. So if you kind of start with spirituality, you often end up, spiritual issues often show themselves much or become most prominent or most begging for an answer when we are in some kind of crisis, or when we are in some liminal space between what's typical and what we had expected and what's not. This is one of my favorite poems by the wonderful Australian cartoonist and columnist Michael Leunig. And he's got figures like this, of the small figures and in the midst of a huge universe. And the poem goes like this: God bless this tiny little boat and me who travels in it. It stays afloat for years and years and sinks within a minute. And so the soul on which we sail, unknown by years of thinking, is deeply felt and understood the minute that it's sinking. Think about those times when we find ourselves sinking. That could be an onset of a mental illness. It could be the onset of a fatal terminal illness. It certainly happens around times of end of life and death and dying, but it can happen around, a sudden diagnosis of a disability. It can happen in times when people are in great danger, multiple kinds of times like this. And he wrote this, in fact, when he was in the midst of a depression. So spirituality, think about it as a twofold definition or construct. It's both one's experience with the sacred and whatever one would consider sacred or holy in one's life, and then its core meaning and values and coping. So those kind of things play together, and then the sense of connection. And that connection can be to oneself, We hear the phrase, to thy own self be true, to be true to who you are at yourself. Connection to others, where you find community and what kinds of forms you find that. Connection to the holy, which doesn't have to necessarily be in a faith community. And connection to places. If I ask you, what are your holy places, or places where you most feel God, it may or may not be in a religious setting. And time. For many people, spirituality is a connection to the past, to the future, to ancestors, and that's more true in many cultures other than some of our Western cultures, for instance. So, but if you look at then from the world of supports and services for people with disabilities, there are other rationales for invoking and including real spirituality in the kinds of supports and the way we look at people and support people. One, it taps the power of the sacred in people's lives. That power can be a power used for good and support, but as we know in the world of mental illness and in the world of disabilities, it can also be used negatively. And one of the reasons historically that people thought psychiatric services and others, mental illness, often did not want to look at spirituality for a long time was because coming out of Freud, anything that was defined as religious or talked about as religious was seen as a symptom of mental illness, not as a way of trying to make meaning out of somebody's life. It's also ways that people try to find meaning and to cope with their lives, with whatever is happening to them. If we want to say as a service system or as an agency that we are culturally competent, as most service agencies and health agencies are required to do these days by federal funding sources, then you cannot say you're culturally competent and be refused to deal with the ways that different faith communities are parts of culture that then may impact a person's identity and who they are and where they are in that community. We also, in the worlds of mental illness and intellectual and developmental disabilities, use the word self-determination and quality of life, that people have the right to make decisions for themselves, to choose what they want. And then our role as professionals or supporters is to help them live the lives that they want to live. And if their choice is that they would like to be more significantly connected to or maintain a connection to a faith community or some other format or form of spirituality, then how do we help them do that and help support that rather than discount it as an important part of somebody's lives? And then I think we're getting more aware of how spirituality is part of the helping professions of all professions and of organizations. You all have worked perhaps in an organization where you felt there's something wrong with the soul of this place. Things are not well. And other organizations where you feel alive and creative. It's the way staff make meaning also as well out of their work and out of what they're doing and trying to support and help people. And then finally, in both areas, all kinds of areas of disability and across life, people deal with grief and loss. And people in the world of disability often swim in that world of grief and loss, but so rarely defined and articulated and dealt with. And it's not just losses at the end of life, losses of friends, losses of staff, turnover in staff, losses of, maybe the life you had before. So, and you can't deal with grief and loss without dealing with spirituality. Also take a look at it from a life transitions perspective. What kinds of spiritual supports are there at the beginning of someone's diagnosis with a disability, whether from at birth or pre-birth or from onset because of an accident or an illness or a trauma? What are the spiritual supports there for individuals and their families? Is there an opportunity for kids who are born with a disability to be included early on, as quickly as they can be, in nurseries, preschool programs, kindergarten and others with other kids, that's an opportunity that's so important for them and their development very early on. You think about the important rites of passage that we have in many faith communities: First Communion, a bar bat mitzvah, walking down the aisle to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, confirmation, all those things which are passages that say, I am claiming membership in this community and we recognize you as one of our own. You belong to us. And in fact, some Protestant traditions and others, the vows of baptism for a congregation are that when the child is baptized, the congregation answers the vow of, do you promise to bring this child up in this community of faith? And think about adult services, that if people are involved in spiritual communities or congregations, for adults, it's a place where they can not only learn and serve and worship, but they can be supported. It's a place for recreation. It's a place where they may be able to contribute by doing something, having a job at the congregation to help that work. And for some of us, a few years ago, we put together a model, and it worked, about helping congregations to see themselves as really resource chest of social capital, that if a congregation wanted to, it could help people with disabilities that it knows to find a job in the community by using the connections and networks to help a person get a job and supporting them in that. And using social capital and networking to get jobs is usually the way, of course, most of us get jobs. And then think about, again, about grief and loss and support for that throughout life and death. And also to say, also times of a celebration. Where do we really celebrate life? And how do we do that in a variety of ways? And more. Think about, there are at least a number of years ago, there were around 340,000 churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples. So in the realm of disability services, we often talk about generics or natural community support organizations. Well, there's the biggest source of them right there. Their faith communities are also the more significant source of donations and volunteers and community leadership. So it behooves, I think, providers of different kinds and advocacy groups to want to work along with them in a variety of ways, as well as support them in their efforts at inclusion or advocacy. And think about, from a congregation side, the power of seeing an agency and its staff live out their call and mission that the agency has about supporting people to be full members of the community. And if they're working with agency staff around including some of the people they support in their congregation, it's a way for them to learn about the quality of the work that goes on in that support agency. And then again, thinking about the power of congregations as networks, as potential employers and potential co-workers. When you look at any congregation, you're looking at a group of people who are employers or potential co-workers. So think about people with disabilities at the crossroads of multiple systems: families, faith communities, service systems with individuals with disabilities kind of in the middle. But let's look at another model, a way of thinking about this, and put spirituality at the heart of it. And it looks like this: that spirituality is at the heart kind of who we are as people, at the heart of both individuals and families, is part of faith communities, as well as part of other kinds of services and supports. And there's also spirituality at the heart of community. The kind of things that our community or our culture thinks are most important, are the traditions that we have developed for dealing with grief and loss and others. So think about spirituality not as a circle over on the side, but as something at the heart of kind of what we do, who we are as individuals, as faith communities, and as a community. If you don't know Eric Carter's work, I would really encourage you to look it up. He's a special educator who works at the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center at Vanderbilt, and his real passion is around faith, inclusion, and spirituality. And he did a research project a number of years ago where they talked to 500 families in Tennessee around what spirituality was for them and what it meant to them and how their churches or synagogues or temples or parishes had been supportive, and a variety of kinds of questions. And coming out of that, he put together a model from those families about what it meant to them, or from people with disabilities. This is from them now, not from somebody imposing a model about what my theological understanding of belonging is, for instance, but coming from them. This is what it meant to move towards a sense of belonging, which is certainly at the heart of much of our spiritual lives, in a way. And to go from the right to belong, you've got to be welcomed. You want to be known. You want to be accepted. You want to be supported. You want to be cared for. You want people to care about you, care for you. You want to be befriended, get to know people as friends. Sorry, you want to be needed. You want a community. You want to have a role in that community. And I did this wrong. And then lastly, you want to get loved and to be loved, to love the community, feel like the community loves you. Should have started at being present first at the top, being present, invited, welcomed. So moving from presence to a sense of real belonging. So that's why some of us in the faith and disability movements these days talk a lot about the importance of belonging, because being included is not the same thing as belonging. And people can live in a community. People with disabilities can live in a community, but that doesn't mean they feel like they belong to the community or feel that they are part of it. And part of it involves all of these kinds of things, which these come out of a faith community, but they can be used as a lens to look at what belonging to a wider community means as well. And then when you come back to the heart of the values in disability services, and I would suggest that these are probably the same in mental health services, although I'm not quite as versed with that, but at the heart of most mission statements are values like independence, productivity, integration, inclusion, self-determination, cultural competence, and now these days, the HCBS standards of using community first before necessarily developing some kind of specialized service. At the heart of those values, those mostly Western values, these are answers to fundamental existential or spiritual questions. The independence, we in the States, in the West, value independence, the question of who am I? I'm supposed to be somebody independent, pull myself up by the bootstraps. That comes partly out of our fear of dependence, for sure, a sense of what it means to be perfectly free or to have power or agency. But it also comes out of our uncertainty about interdependence as well. So there are money cultures who do that, I think, in more helpful ways. Productivity, it's the kind of, in the States, we and parts of the West say, it's what do you do for work? What's your job? That's how you answer the question of purpose, your vocation, your calling. But why am I? The call to make a difference with the life you've been given, or what has God called me to do, or how can I know that I'm making a contribution, is broader than jobs as well. For some people, jobs are just a means to an end for other ways that they can contribute to their community. So we got to think more broadly about finding ways for people to contribute. While jobs are awesome, very, very important because it's a key thing. And then integration is the question of inclusion. It's not the who am I question, it's the whose am I question underneath the who am I. In fact, my wife, who's a biblical scholar, would say the biblical question is whose am I, not who am I. The question is who do we belong to? We belong to God, we belong to God's people, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And self-determination, what kind of choices do I have? How can I shape my life? Who gives me a chance to make my own decisions and learn from mistakes? And can I learn and respect from others who think and believe and act differently than I do? So at the heart of those values, And in both intellectual and disability services, developmental disability service, and in mental health, person-centered planning is kind of the gospel these days. It's been coming for a while. It's been very creative edges and services and supports, but it essentially means, and there are multiple forms of doing it and ways of doing it, but essentially means starting with somebody, with an individual and who they are, not starting with as a whole, not starting with a diagnosis or a deficit, but starting with the wholeness of somebody, who they are. Looking at that question of identity, who am I? What are my dreams? What are my connections? What are my passions? What are my supports? And then asking the question not only of what's important for you because you have a disability or a mental illness, what kinds of services and supports do you need because of those issues, but what's important to you? What are the things that are most important to you? Which is different than, so it's more of a strength and capacity-based vision than it is, and a gifts vision than it is a deficit. If you want to do this sometime in a group, is a really fun exercise. Write I am and write 10 blanks beneath that. And then list out qualities, interests, passions, habits, characteristics, roles that define who you are and that are most important to you. And the one rule is you cannot use your job, because we as Americans in particular, the first question is after what's your name is what do you do? But we are much broader than that, or as that wonderful TED Talk says, none of us are a single story. And when we say anybody, the danger of a single story, that wonderful TED Talk, when we try to define people by just a disability story or a disability label, that's something they have to deal with all the time. So thinking about the steps about how we go about this through services and providers and others. Start with person-centered planning and make sure spirituality and faith is part of the asking and the questioning and getting to know somebody. For instance, if a family comes in with a son or daughter to move into services and they're almost adults, one of the things you might ask them is, how has your family dealt with losses in the past? What are the traditions? And then sets up a conversation for saying, this is what we know is important as an agency, that when somebody has a loss in their life of a relative or others, these are the things we try to do and to hit that head on, rather than waiting till there's an unexpected death and then you run into sometimes people not wanting a person with an intellectual disability or autism to come to a funeral. So set that up in about what your goals and aims are. Think about agency policy, staff training, and the supports needed to help those wishes and dreams become real. It needs to be in policy. It needs to be in training. It's the best of community networking and building community supports, community inclusion. Working with faith communities is a prime example of that, where the learnings there work with other areas in the community as well, and the things you learn from other areas of community building that are not coming out of the faith communities also work well in faith communities. And we'll talk more about that. Then think about connecting with faith communities and making introductions of your services and who you are, who you all support. John O'Brien says that the quality of people's lives often depend upon the quality of their introductions and their invitations. Now, how do we introduce people? And do we talk about we've got 10 clients or consumers at a group home? Or do we talk about these are my friends and people we support individually, Jim and John or Sarah, and their particular interest perhaps in your faith background? And then how do we as an agency think about working with congregations to provide awareness and education with them as needed, recognizing that there are also lots of work in the religious communities now these days working on inclusive faith supports, and then move towards a sense of shared responsibility to address these issues and to help move beyond just attending, to move towards possible membership and contributions and helping people really feel like they're part of the community. The agency can't say, oh, we're just going to, and this has happened in my past, where they take people from a group home and they just dump them on the church steps on a Sunday morning. Well, that's not going to work. You've got to have the sense of share. How can we work together to help a person to move in a way where they become actually a viable and real part of that community? One of the simple spiritual assessments comes out of the world of health services and medical care, back to Christine Polchowski. And it's an easy one because you stick it in your pocket and it goes on your check. What comes out in your FICA segment? You think about faith. Do you have a preference or a choice? Are you part of a tradition? Is a religious something part of your identity or your family's identity? How important is it to you? What kind of influence does it have in your life? And if somebody said, I need to pray 5 times a day, how do we help that to happen? Or I need to make sure I go to the service on this time or whatever. Then what kind of communal expression might that take? What would you like it to take? What would you like to be part of a community if you're not? And then for healthcare providers and human service providers, how can we help you with this? Or how can I help you with this? And then, because you're not going to do it all for somebody, and you shouldn't. And you shouldn't proselytize about saying, oh, you can come to me with my church, whether or not that's your background. But that's the way you begin to get at how can we think about building these supports into the wider array of supports that we're building. The questions you can ask people. Have they expressed interest in faith or religion? Does he or she belong to a particular one? Is there a name or a place or contacts out there that people know? Do they know? What do they do there? This is the individuals with disabilities or with mental illness. What do they already do there if they're connected? Would they like to do more? Would they like to be more involved? And can we develop a kind of action plan to help that to happen? And we've got to then, that's got to be very individualized. At another call today, I just told the story in New Jersey, we had a pastoral care student working at an ARC at an agency, and she was doing a kind of a quasi-spiritual assessment of everybody who was supported by that agency. And she was visiting a particular group home, and the staff said, and I'll come back to that story in a minute, but the staff said, oh yeah, we participate in church and religious things. We watch church on TV every Sunday. People really enjoy that. They're part of that. And that's usually how we do it. And then she said, well, is everybody here Christian? And the staff said, yeah, we think they're all Christian. And then she asked, well, this one guy, he seems to have a Jewish name. And he said, no, he's not Jewish. He's Christian. And she went up to him and said, I think his name was Stan. And she said, Shabbat. And he responded quickly, Shalom. And all of a sudden, you knew that there was a whole tradition and part of his life that hadn't been tapped into or explored. And the wonderful ending to that story was that there was a synagogue about a quarter of a mile away that was just beginning to think about how they could be more inclusive and welcoming of people with disabilities. And so the agency and they got to be matchmakers there. Think about it other ways. Are there other ways people observe their religion or spirituality? Go back to that question of loss assessments with individuals and families. How have people traditionally in their family, in their culture, dealt with loss? Are there very special occasions that they want to be part of? Or like for many other people, other kinds of activities, to go back to the first one, are the ways that they live out and express their spirituality, getting out to nature, hikes, being an avid fan of some sports club, some kind of other kind of community that where they really feel connected and where they feel accepted for who they are. And there are other things that people would like to do. And what does the family think as well as what the individual thinks? Now, to go back to that story at the ARC, the student tried to ask questions, and she trained other people to ask questions of everybody living in the group homes around what was most important to people. What are the things that are most important to you? And out of all it wasn't a form, it was a dialogue and a conversation, and they wrote down different answers that people had. And then they had an intern, social studies intern, who compiled all of those answers and put similar ones together And they did a Wordle with it, which is, if you know, is a way of highlighting the answers that the bigger the answer letter is, the more people answered that kind of way. So look at the kind of spiritual snapshot of this agency where the questions and things that people are worried about. I need help to get there, thinking about going to a church. But so many of them are around friendship, or my friend doesn't live here. How can I see my friends back at the institution where I once was and where they once were? And I was friends with them for years, but I don't ever get to see them now. Or I don't even want to think about that place. Or my best friend died. I need a friend to sit with. How do I deal with death with my mom? I can't live alone. All those kinds of questions that really get at the heart of kind of what's most important to people. And if we're honest, would be things that are really important to each of us as well. So if we listen to people, parents, people with disabilities in their own words, what Eric Carter in that study and his colleagues found, and this is sort of compiling and shortening some of what he found, but families said the things that were most important to them were that the congregation offer welcoming and positive attitudes, that they make sure the environment's accessible, that they provide education and training to members so they know something about disability, that they offer parental support or individual support during services. For instance, once doing a workshop a long time in New Jersey, I had a group home supervisor who said, Bill, I take my guys with me to my Assemblies of God, I think it was Pentecostal church on Sunday, all 6 of them, and they love being there. And I said, oh, wait, and she said, I'm a fairly important person in that congregation. I said, well, wait a minute. If you're taking those 6 guys there, first, if they all want to be there, that's fine. But if you know everybody there, couldn't you work on some ways to get each of those persons connected up with 1 or 2 other people so they aren't sitting together on one pew on Sunday morning and maybe continuing a fight they had at breakfast, but get to know then and get more scattered throughout the congregation. And so people can get to know them individually. One of the things that's happening in religious education these days is a lot of congregations are using older kids to be buddies for children in religious education, children with disabilities in religious education programs. So that kind of finding people who can be a spiritual guide, a buddy, is a kind of way to help think about how can we get people more acclimated or enculturated into the life of that congregation. What kinds of supports, families wonder, do they have outside of worship services? And does this faith community offer ways for us to serve and for individuals to give as well as to be recipients of the care and help of others? So moving from plans and thinking about this and talking to people to action, you got to have support from the top. It can't just be put on direct support, support professionals. Many of them often are immigrants or people who are working on their own sense of community and connections. And if they're immigrants, especially the communities in which they're working, may be strange territory, a new territory to them. So you've got to have support. And I think you've got to have people kind of at all levels helping to think about how we can connect people. We need to do staff training and awareness about spiritual supports and the importance of them. Use internal networks. You find an agency that has a group home with a guy who's, let's say, conservative Jewish, and you don't know people who are conservative Jews. Can you go throughout the staff of the agencies and say, any of you conservative Jewish by background, or do you know some? So who do you know who knows somebody that can maybe help us with these connections? We've got to be sensitive to staff concerns or anxiety. Staff who take people to a faith community sometimes are concerned because, especially if it's not their faith tradition, they feel like they're being imposed upon or they're being asked to believe something differently when they're not, but they need some training then about what it means to be a coach and a companion in those areas, and to help people in that setting see the personhood and humanity of the person they're with? How can we be creative with transportation issues? If a congregation wanted to say to a group home, we'd be glad to come by and pick a couple of people up. Or they used to come to our services, but then when they moved to a group home, they stopped. Most agencies would say, oh, well, sorry, we're not sure we can do that because of their fears about liability or other things. But if we talk about natural supports and you say, if a congregation says, well, we'd like to come by and pick up one or two people that we already know to come, then how can we help that natural support to happen? And think about risk assessment and risk management through a different lens than just liability. So it's sometimes the agency has the barriers to community participation. Think about it doing one by one, just as supported employment, you do it one by one. We all know that too many times community outings mean with a group, and that doesn't facilitate getting included or getting connected to people. And remembering at the heart of this, it's about not program or worship service or job or what it's or club or hobby. It's about relationships. How do we build relationships? How do we help people build relationships beyond the circle of relationships that they have? And those of you who know about person-centered planning and the relationship map know that so many people have so few relationships other than their close family or staff or formal paid supports. How do we help to build those other relationships? Community building, whose job is it? Well, then for agencies, I think you got to think about, again, what we just said a minute ago, everybody becomes a community builder. I mean, you may have somebody in your business office who knows somebody who's a Mets fan who could say, oh yeah, I could connect Jim, who's a great Mets fan, with some other Mets fans. I bet they'd be glad to meet him. To think about who's got those connections. Service providers have got to be hospitable. You've got to welcome people in both directions. You can't expect faith communities to just be the only ones welcoming. Is your agency a welcoming and hospitable environment? If you want to go to a website called Community Activators, and there's a wonderful CD that's called Opening Doors, about how agencies changed their way of being by the ways they looked at what it meant to welcome people into their agency. And think about the mutual responsibility between support systems, families, faith communities. And if you're a large provider, think about somebody who in a role of a spiritual supports coordinator who can help staff and friends and family and congregations and others to be a connector and a coach, and not be the one responsible for all this, but helping to be, as David Brooks in the New York Times would say, a weaver, and helping weave people into the fabric of community life. Community building is also based on gifts rather than needs. You don't go out and say, I've got a guy and these are his mental illness diagnoses and we'd like to get him connected to. You base it on, this is a person I know and these are the things he's interested in and these are gifts and these are issues he has. But we build communities on gifts. We build service systems based on needs. You got to think about capacity rather than deficits and what strengths can be used. And you've got to think about friendships and partnerships rather than providers of service. And it's back to the core thing of relationships and building relationships. So to go back to the TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, I spent years trying to work as a person in an agency, as a chaplain and others. Over here on the right-hand side, the person in the community, trying to work with congregations and faith communities to build relationships with people considered other because of their label, intellectually disabled, mental illness, or whatever that other label is. And what I learned finally from the best of community builders in the world of disability services is that you can't start with this disability story. You've got to think about what are the third things that connect people. What are the third things that might be common to both people, go back to those 10 parts of your identity. What might connect people? What's the what? Would it be a sports passion? Would it be a hobby? Would it be eating a particular kind of food, a particular kind of music? Would it be, you name those things. Then who are the people that share those passions, and where do they meet, and when do they meet? And how might we get the person that we're working with connected to them? And then the philosophical and spiritual question is why we want to do that and why it's so important. It happens to deal with what's at the heart of life and quality of life. So we've got to be able to see people and look at them in terms of possible characteristics and ways that can be used and tapped to connect them with others. What are those third things? We often, in sociology, there's a thing about what are the third places in our communities. Third places means places other than home or jobs. The third places where people gather: bars, in the UK, pubs, farmers markets, sports events, congregations. What are those third places where we might build relationships that don't come from being family or from our jobs? Who are the people there? How do we know those? Where do they gather? And the roles about helping to do this are finding people who are good askers and introducers and coachers, cultural brokers, spiritual supports coordinators. There are some really important kinds of sophisticated skills that are there, but there are also people who've never had any training about that out in the community who do it really well for the very organizations that you might want to be working with. Begin with introductions. Who do you know that knows somebody there? If you're helping somebody to get connected to a faith community, maybe visit beforehand. Get those introductions beforehand, before a Friday service or a Saturday service or a Sunday service. Don't just show up on Sunday. Get some help from the congregation, kind of maybe walking them through what happens on a Sunday morning. It could be, again, spiritual, but getting people to know and feel at home in a place where they might want to go and what they are to do. Remember that every single faith community and community organization has what the autism world calls a hidden curriculum. That these are the ways we act and behave and what's expected. Maybe not in writing, but it's there in that community. And you want to be able to help people learn as much as possible about that curriculum and be able to work with it and learn from it, while at the same time helping that community to perhaps broaden and move beyond the expectations that they've had in the past. How do we talk to people in communities around spirituality and community connections and relationships? It's not the language of charts and lesson planning and assessments and charting. It's the language of vision, art, symbols, belief, images, poetry, values. If you're working with a faith community or another organization, what's their vision? Not your vision for them, but what's their vision? And how can you learn to then, if you know their vision, how can you help see what welcoming a person with a disability might be a way of them living out their vision, not the vision you have as a service provider? How does this fulfill their mission? And also you can share how it might fulfill an individual's dreams. Tell stories about people, share observations and experiences. And remember that you're inviting people who maybe have not done this before into an outward journey about helping people come in and be included, but it's also can be a real inward journey about helping people to realize they've got capacity to relate to others that they didn't know that they have, the capacity to get over the fears and questions that they may have. And we, as we work in secular settings, can also be celebrants and blessers. I mean, you've got the power to help others celebrate the significance of the things that they do and welcome that. You've got direct support staff who do a good job of connecting somebody to a faith community or organization. By golly, support that as an agency and bless that and model that as the kind of thing we're hoping to do, because we're learning then to help people get connected to others. Or sometimes, as I say, it's kind of the opposite of our professional idiom of come to us and we'll take care of you. What we're learning in community building is how do we give people away so they're connected to more than just the support, the formal service systems in their lives. And it's a relationship building. And so helping some organization to embrace people who are labeled other because of disability of any kind. This model called the Dance of Embrace comes out of a book by Miroslav Volf, who's a public theologian these days, who's done a lot of writing. And the book come out of a book, and I forget it's the Exclusion or Embrace is the name of the book. And it came out of all the antagonisms in Central Europe during the Croatian wars and all that, and came out of trying to figure out how do we learn to relate to the other. And he has this really helpful little thing that can be really simple, but it's a simple model. And he's talking to people of faith. And he says, are we as Christians or Jews or Muslims called to automatically embrace the other? And we would say usually dutifully, oh yeah, we are. We're supposed to. That's what we're supposed to be a good Christian. He says, no, we're called to have the will to do so. We're called to have the will and the vision to do so. So that then the first movement is you move towards somebody with their arms open, with your arms open, or hand out to shake, or elbows to bump in the COVID days. But think symbolically here as a dance. And then the next step in this is not to move towards a hug or an embrace, but the next step may be then to step back. Because if you've got your hand out and you want to welcome, you've got to get to know who that person is. And they've got to have their own voice. And you don't want them to feel run over by your care and concern and just stuff about people and body spaces anyway, but people can feel run over sometimes by people's wanting to help them without really asking them what help they want and what they might need and getting to know that person. So you step back and listen, and then finally you move towards a partnership and times of perhaps embracing and getting more particular. So there's also a movement of the spirit that a Catholic chaplain taught me a long time ago. He was a Catholic chaplain in an institution working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities like the Willowbrooks and Letchworths of the old up in upstate New York, where I worked once as well. And he worked with people in the community to get them in as volunteers. And he told me, he said, you know, Bill, people move from being afraid to pity to anger to love. And that really struck me because at first it fit my journey. I was afraid at first when I was called into or got assigned into pastoral care with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. My first responses sometimes were ones of feeling sorry for people or families. But then as I got to know people, I began to get angry, especially when I heard stories about maybe how they had been turned away from faith communities or the injustices or the stereotypes that had been heaped upon them. And then I would want to work or do something for people with disabilities, work with them and advocate with them for something different. But people with disabilities will often say to you, no, Bill, don't do it for me, do it with me. Let's do it together. Until you get to the point where you feel like, well, I may be doing something for this person, but they're teaching me a whole lot. We're learning a lot. And so a congregation can kind of go through that same kind of movement of being afraid. And it also matches our social history here. We put people in institutions because of fears. We then move to specialized services and special services, this and that and other. And some people might say we trained the community to think they did not have the capacity to embrace people with disabilities because you had to have special training to do that. But then you move to an advocacy when people had to move towards advocating for social justice and disability rights, till then moving to the point where people with disabilities begin to feel like they're really part of a community and that they're making contributions, that they are contributing and are being active contributors rather than simply receivers or consumers. All right, come on, move along here. So, working with and within faith communities, then when you're working with them, and we work with anybody in the community, any questions they have about the person with disability or what y'all are doing are valid. Don't think of them as stupid. Focus on their capacity to do what you can't. You may be the best Catholic there is working for an agency, and you may be working then with a person who's served by that agency who's Catholic. But you as an agency staff person cannot be the parish for that person. They've got the capacity to be the community for that person that you cannot be. And they're the ones who know how to help a person belong to that community, because you may live and work somewhere else and not be a member of that parish at all. And that can go with anything. You may find somebody who really wants to be a Yankees fan, God help them, so pardon my prejudice, and especially for Fordham. But you might say, you might get them connected to another Yankee fan, and you might not be a baseball fan at all, but you might say, you're a Yankee fan, and you know how to be a Yankee fan. I don't know how to be a Yankee fan, but this guy really wants to be a Yankee fan and connect with other Yankee fans. You know how to do that. Build work from their capacity to do that and say, we'll help you with the disability stuff to get over that, but help them think they've got the capacity first out of the things they're passionate about. You've got to deal honestly with concerns about behavior. You can't just say faith communities got to overlook behavioral issues, because too many times I've seen faith communities say, okay, we welcome this person, but they're acting out and stuff, and I guess we have to accept it because they can't help it. And all of it, and they don't say anything, or they don't give anybody any feedback to work with. And all the time, then they're getting more and more frustrated until something will happen and the whole thing will blow up and the relationship will end. So getting connected into a congregation means a lot of learning and helping people learn in both directions. And figuring out strategies for learning the congregational culture and what's that hidden curriculum, and being able to share other stories of congregational inclusion. If St. Francis can do that as a parish, by golly, we ought to be able to do that at St. Mary's, because this is what they're doing. And we've got stories to tell because other people are doing this. If you're working with faith communities, you've also got to be able to talk not just in stories and beliefs and vision and art and values and symbols, but get your feet into things about the theological issues that are about welcoming people to people with disabilities. One of the core spiritual traditions of all major faith traditions is the core belief about hospitality to the stranger, which our whole country is having a hard time with these days. But that hospitality to the stranger in those Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic religions was not just about our obligation to the stranger, but because the stranger had something to bring to us, the host, that we were often the receivers out of that welcoming and that hospitality. And they lived in a world where if they couldn't be welcomed in a desert oasis, they couldn't be, or they wouldn't welcome others, and that hospitality, their very lives depended upon it. And we're about reconnecting the body of the people of God, or the body of Christ, or the Muslim Ummah, however you want to say that. You're about remembering, helping people become members again if they've got disconnected. It's partly about restoring the sanctuary, maybe with accessibility things, but is your sanctuary a safe place for people with disabilities and their families, especially a safe place for mental illness? And it may take a while to get there, and there are ways to work on that, because so often people with mental illness will say, I have not felt like I'm safe in my congregation because of things that have happened in the past. How can we then help people see the gifts that people with any form of disability have, and learn to use those gifts in their service to God and service to others in the community? They are called to be disciples or followers or believers as well. And how do we help them use their gifts? In Maine, where we've often vacationed on Mount Desert Island, there's a place of recycling places that were called redemption centers. And I always thought, wow, would be a wonderful metaphor for a church or a synagogue to think about taking people who've sometimes been cast aside as worthless or not seen as very valuable and bringing them to a place where they essentially are seen, they have worth and value. That's what redemption means. And by doing all this, of course, while we're working with people with all kinds of sensory abilities and physical abilities, we're having to think about how we communicate our love and faith and community in all kinds of sensory ways, just like these wonderful signers are doing, or the person doing captioning, or hearing loops and accessibility, and just all kinds of maybe picture things that go with the order of the Mass. Lots of people are doing lots of creative things. There are videos for congregations and for agencies. Believing, belonging, becoming. You're going to get this PowerPoint if you want it, and it'll have the link to that. It's an 11-minute video showing 4 congregational inclusion stories from Wisconsin, 2 kids and 2 adults. There are tons of written resources and web pages out there now compared to within last. Within your own faith networks, there are resource offices and resources. There are others doing the same thing. I can promise you that you may well want to see done. There are ecumenical and interfaith networks that connect people, and it's across all the dimensions of congregational life, not just religious education and worship. Tips for providers coming from secular services or supports: use what you don't know. You don't have to pretend that you know a faith tradition or what a congregation does. So ask for help with that, because they're the ones who know. So use what you don't know, or with any other kind of activity that you don't know. We as professionals are taught to pretend that we know everything sometimes. And I think the best definition of a professional is somebody who knows what they don't know and is willing to use that to pull in other people. Help people see that others have gifts that they have that you cannot possibly give to them as an employee or as an agency. Help people to see the gifts that others may have that they don't recognize. That may be people with disabilities or so-called typical people. Help faith communities and agencies to put their faith and values into action and find ways to contribute so there's a mutuality back and forth. For instance, in Georgia, there was a self-advocacy group in a town that started showing up at community work days at congregations and other places in the community. Not to say you should include people with disabilities, but just showed up with gloves and bags and ready to work, and showing their willingness to contribute. And they built relationships in that out of their contributions with a number of people in the community. You want people to go from being unnoticed to noticed and known. So people really know who I am. We're wanting people to go from, and this was in Rochester when I was there, I had a minister once say to me, "Bill, I saw 6 of your people at the mall yesterday." And the people he was talking about were people who lived in a group home where some of them were coming to his church. And I wanted to say, they're not my people anymore, they're your people. Hopefully your congregation has a sense that these are your people, that there are people now that they don't belong to, the Best Baptist, wonderful person-centered support system or whatever. You want the people to have a sense of belonging, and that's where we move from beyond inclusion to belonging. And I'm going to finish this up quickly. It comes down to what we think about belief and belonging, not about whether people understand, but do we believe this is an important part of people's lives? It comes down to honoring and facilitating relationships, not what we know, but are we known? And it comes down, I think, to finding ways to help everybody contribute to respond to God's call to them. And there's some other resources I'm going to go in that I'm going to have on the PowerPoint. I'm not going to go into those. You can get the PowerPoint later. They may just send it out to all of you who registered. There are a lot of plenary videos at the Institute on Theology and Disability. If you want to keep up with this arena, like our Facebook page. There's some mental health organizations that do the same thing and work in lots with congregations around mental health. And if you want more from me, there's my book. And if a group of you or a class or something decide to use it, I've got a study guide. Would be glad to talk with you more about that. So let's open it up for questions and see what people's response is and feedbacks. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Here he is.
I am here. And so thank you very much. Excellent presentation. And so at this time, we just remind folks that you can enter your questions into the Q&A link at the bottom of your page, of what you're looking at. And let's see, looks like we have a couple here.
We have 2 questions.
Okay. So this one is, I'm reading the second one from Wendy, how to balance the sacred versus secular in a congregation. Not all accommodations for persons that happen in school or work can be done within faith traditions. Emotional support animals is one example.
Well, I've seen emotional support animals done within congregations. That people understood that that was what it would take for them to participate and do that. And people got the right kind of awareness building and training beforehand. But the thing, and it also relates to the first question, Frank, as I looked at briefly, we'll go back to in more depth, that the accommodations that may be mandated in the ADA don't necessarily apply to religious congregations, faith communities. They do if they're getting any kind of federal funding for any kind of programs. And many congregations have worked on accessibility things that are in tune with that. But one of the issues that has built a gap between disability justice advocates and faith communities is because the religious communities begged out of the ADA. And that's been a wound that's been there for a long time. In fact, rather than religious communities being at the forefront, like of the civil rights movement, they begged out. And it wasn't necessarily because of issues about accessibility and disability. It had at that point in time to do with fears about having to hire somebody who might be disabled, or there's still a big gap about hiring clergy or staff who have a disability. And it also had to do with whether or not they would have to, whether that would apply to other things back in the 80s when all the controversy was going on about AIDS and people with different sexual orientations and so on. It's not a good history. And there's no easy answer, but all I can say is there's been a lot of work since then by a lot of people trying to help build that work. And this thing about a diagnostic, thinking of diagnosis of demonic possession for people with schizophrenia, people have got those, but their resources, how can we atone for that? That's a good question. And I think there are people in faith communities and who are writing theologically, who are in practice trying to atone for that and to come at this from a much different kind of perspective. Like with, for instance, the recovery movement in mental illness, schizophrenia, who might have fantasies or, while thinking about spirituality or religious things, we can help people of faith to see, and people psychiatry and psychology say, not to question the reality of that necessarily, that belief or image, but what purpose is that serving in that for that person? What's the need behind that for that to be lived out or believed out in that way? And how to atone for it? I think it's going to be, oh Lord, there have been campaigns to try to do that. The year of 2000 congregational accessibility campaign, inclusion campaign. There have been lots of religious group statements of mission and purpose about welcoming people with disabilities that are more there in principle than they are in practice for many. And almost every major faith group has done something like that, a statement on disability. But you're still running into some of those attitudes. And what you've got to have, if we're going to help people atone, I think is stories that come out from the other side, resources and stories that come out from the other side about places where people have refused to deal with the thing about demonic possession, or have people with disabilities talk about the woundedness and the negative impact of how that, I mean, there are people with physical disabilities who will tell you about how wounding it was to be used as an object to try for healing prayer in front of the congregation or to be healed. And one of my favorite stories happened in the Bronx. There was a guy who in a wheelchair who just had gotten kind of sick of that stuff. And not just in a faith community. If you're in a wheelchair and know people, you will have people come up to you out of the blue and say, "Can I pray over you?" I mean, almost everybody in a wheelchair has had that experience. And this guy, somebody came up to him and said, can I pray over you? If you believe strong enough, you could be healed. And he said right back to her, well, if you believe strong enough, you could cure me. And that, in fact, is more attuned to the New Testament than it is to what we think about faith healing. Because Jesus's questions are around the faith of the disciples, not around the faith of the person who was being healed. It was really about whether their faith was big enough to embrace these people who had been kicked out or left by the side before, in that kind of way. And I think there are a lot of people with disabilities who've been accused of that in the past, about if your faith was strong enough. You wouldn't say that to somebody who has cancer. You wouldn't say that, to somebody well, if your faith had been strong enough, you wouldn't have had that car accident, so you've got to help deconstruct some of these things and then help provide some alternative responses to that. So I don't know. I think through the statements, I'd be glad to Lolly to talk more about that, and put you maybe in touch with some other people. But it's a really good question, and there's some historical roots for that. Acceptance and overlooking behaviors. There are things, I think, Ken, that there is a place where we get to a point where somebody says, no, they really can't change something. That's part of who they are. Now, those kinds of behaviors are usually a lot more welcome with kids than they are with some of those adults, or as they get into teenagehood. That's where this kind of hidden curriculum starts taking place. That's why so many families who've got kids with what we would call behavioral issues, or different kinds of behavioral issues, where so many neurotypical people then have problems with kids with autism, is because, well, can't they learn to behave and whatever? And yet, so I think that if the faith community especially if somebody's grown up in that faith community and people have gotten to know them and got to know the person behind those behaviors and what people are trying to do both in school and at the faith community, then you can work on ways, for instance, that you can maybe, one, help the individual learn the kinds of things that are typical to learn and show them how to do it, and provide multiple opportunities for them to practice. And on the other hand, help the community learn that some things people can change and some things they cannot. And then broaden that question. we accept a lot of people in this congregation who behave in ways that we don't like. It may not be outwardly visible in that, but that people have done things that we think is wrong, or what other kinds of things like that. So it's working, I think, in both directions, and not putting it on the burden of the person with the disability. It has more to do with teaching and learning in both directions, and helping as much as possible to help someone to learn. Let me give you an example. Catholic, Archdiocese of Newark. They got to work with the psychology department at Caldwell College and helped families who had kids on the severe end of the autism spectrum to learn what they needed to learn by lots of good autism teaching styles and ways of doing that. Help them learn what it was to participate in a first communion, so that then that child could go through that first communion process with the other kids who went through it at the same time, and have had great success in that. I mean, so if you had told me 20 years ago that we would marry ABA, applied behavioral analysis, with CCD, I would have said there's no way, because they don't talk the same language, all kinds of stuff. But that's where some of the kinds of things have begun to happen, and people can begin to change. There's a evangelical person, Emily Colson, who's written a book called Dancing with Max, her son who has autism, and he's a teenager. They finally went back to church. And she didn't take him to the beginning of the service. She took him to the end, kind of do what they call backward chaining in autism. Start at the end and then leave, and then come back a little bit earlier in the service and then leave. And at one of the first services he met the guys who was putting up the chairs after the service. And he got involved with them in putting up the chairs. And they got to know him, and he became part of their crew. And they became his champions in that church. And they were the ones who then got him woven into the congregation. So I think it's kind of a thing that works both ways. And they stopped coming, the next one, because its behavior includes speaking loudly and spontaneously. Where to begin with this in relationship to community worship? Well, I think it would depend upon working with the pastor, working with others in the church, with the family, to say, do you have a sense about what his son was trying to do or say? Was he joining in his own way? Or was he bored and wanting to do something else? Was he trying to say, I want out of here? Or, there was a story out of North Jersey with a rabbi whose son had autism, and he was included in the Holy Day services, and the son started kind of making sounds and voices along to some of the chants that the cantor was doing, but were not discernible in terms of words. And after the service, the cantor came up and said, he ruined my service. And for the rabbi's perspective, that was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard, was his son chanting along with the flow and the cadence of the service. So part of that, there's an Episcopal story about somebody being asked to leave because their son was doing that, and they went to the mom and the son went out to the vestibule, and they stayed there, and they could continue to hear the service, and her son continued to make noise, and they got to when she realizes that the noises he was making was in tune with the noises that were coming out of the service. And the irony was that the passage of the day was, let the children come unto me. A Methodist story I know out of South Jersey. This happened when visiting clergy was there, and clergy person asked a mom with a disruptive kid to leave. And the mother was just heartbroken by that and really hurt. And the regular pastor found out about that and finally said to the mom, come back. We can do. And her son started to do that again. And mom started to get up and to leave. And she said, the pastor said from the pulpit, stop right there. He's part of our committee. We'll figure this out somehow. And So, it's just, I think you've got to really dissect the specifics and try to figure out what's going on. And maybe, are there ways that son could be involved in the service or doing things? Maybe he wants to be an usher or whatever. I don't know. Mary Ann Hubble, the more open spirituality arena, I think it's pretty wide. Where the Theology and Disability Institute is multi-faith, so it's not one faith tradition. And I think it's because it's wonderful to see the stuff happening across faith traditions where people are dealing with the same kinds of experiences, asking the same kinds of questions. And so, I think and we have people come who are not necessarily or be involved who are not necessarily parts of faith traditions. Get connected, and you can decide whether or not it feels appropriate. Don't assume because we put the word theology there that it means an unreadable textbook. Sorry, Father Frank. Or my book, for instance. One of the wonderful things about this is it gets theology down to the very core of physicality and what things mean down at the ground. Making a massive accessibility survey. I don't think people would be insulted. I think if you know people with disabilities already, talk to them about it before you send a survey. But and you may have to define what you mean by accessible. Do you mean can they get in? Do you mean where they sit? Do you mean can they hear? So you've got to look at what that word means to different kinds of people. Do they feel welcome? Do they feel included? Again, go back maybe to think about using some of Eric Carter's model about those parts of belonging. So those are quick answers to all those things. You guys are welcome to be in email touch with me. There are a lot of good people around the country working on this stuff. My goal these days is to introduce you to them. If I don't know something, I could pretty well tell you I know somebody who is doing something like that. And like the project we did, some of us did, Eric Carter and I did a few years ago, about thinking about faith communities as huge reservoirs of social capital and networking, and the possibility of faith communities helping people with disabilities find a job by helping learn what the passions they have and what their interests are, and then look at your congregation as a whole network of employees and employers and people who might share that passion, and helping that network in the congregation to get mobilized, because it's not making the church have a supported employment program. It's about getting Bill a job or getting him something to do after he's aged out of school and doesn't want to sit around in a day program.
Okay, well, thank you, Bill. Very helpful and very enlightening. I noticed that your email address is on the PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's very easy. It's bill.gaventa@gmail.com. So,
okay. And so I may be sending you some questions that are coming from the class that had to leave early.
Yeah, we'll get them back to that class, or if you want me to, Frank, I could join them in the class for a few minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, it was the end of their course. And
right. Oh, okay.
So thank you very much. And so to everyone who is still with us, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, send me an email at fmcaloon@fordham.edu. It's on the address is on the original invitation. And then, and this will be a taped version of this will be posted on the website for Fordham's Research Consortium on Disability. So if you just go to the Fordham website and put in Research Consortium Disability, it'll come up.
And kudos, by the way, Frank, to Fordham for the careful preparation for this, the practicing beforehand, for including both sign language and captioning. A lot of places would not have done that. So talking about making things accessible, you did.
Well, you're welcome. And thank you to all those who have helped us with the various aspects of making this possible technologically and otherwise. So thank you very much, Bill, and best wishes. God bless.
My pleasure. All to you as well.
All righty. Bye-bye.